Hi, I'm Chris McHaney, Head of Investment Management and Strategy at Global X, and today I'm joined with Brooke.
Hi, I'm Brooke Thackray, Research Analyst with Global X.
Today we're going to discuss uranium, how that fits into the nuclear energy market, and more broadly, energy in general. Brooke, let's take a look at uranium. I think there's been a lot of positive headlines, uranium and nuclear related recently. How has that fed through to the underlying markets, the uranium price itself and uranium equities?
Yeah, well, it's been a really frustrating experience for investors investing in uranium equities because they know the long-term case for uranium is strong. We know that there's a deficit on a go-forward basis. It doesn't matter which agency you're looking at and who's doing the numbers. By 2040, there's not enough uranium to meet the demand. In fact, right now we are in a deficit as well. We've seen a lot of positive news come out. We've seen the hyperscalers, the data centers, basically come out and say, hey, we want to introduce nuclear power into helping us support our networks. And that all of a sudden gives uranium and uranium stocks a bit of a bump for a couple of days, and then it seems to fade away again. And we see governments come out and say, hey, we're going to introduce more nuclear power. And that seems to give a little bit of a bump to the uranium stocks, and then they come back down again. And countries that had used nuclear power before, we're cutting back on nuclear power. For instance, Japan, after the Fukushima incident in 2011, basically stopped using nuclear power, and then they're now getting back on stream into nuclear power. Germany, the same thing. They were cutting back their nuclear power, and now they're coming back and saying, well, we need nuclear power on a go-forward basis as part of a green environmental solution. There's been a lot of positives, and so it's been a frustrating experience because we haven't seen that big, huge ramp up in price. Now, uranium is up. The actual material is up from 2016 at this point, but we really haven't seen it perform as well as we could have.
Let's talk about some of those drivers and some of those quote-unquote good news stories. You mentioned Japan bringing nuclear back online, Germany as well. And I think as well, we also mentioned the data centers and a new source of demand. This is really something that's net new to uranium and nuclear in general. Of course, we're talking about countries wanting their own energy independence, so to speak, and so turning to nuclear for that. But how big could this sort of, I'll call it a private demand for nuclear and for uranium from the data centers, from those hyperscalers, all those AI models that need to run and continuously run? Is that real? How big is that? And could that outstrip other sources of demand that we're already seeing in the marketplace?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So this is a new source of demand that's taking place, and there's different projections by different agencies, but by 2030, it looks like AI is going to add, through their data center demand on electricity, 9%, an additional 9%. That's quite a bit. That's by 2030. On a go-forward basis, we could see even higher from that. And so that's been driving a lot of the potential as far as building, for instance, small modular reactors, SMRs. We're finding some of the hyperscalers are saying, well, we want to use SMRs in that particular capacity to help with our production, basically of running the data centers. And other like Microsoft has said, well, we want our own nuclear facility basically to give us our own power. And now Meta has just come out and said, we want our own nuclear power. And they're not saying, well, we want a different source. And like, for instance, solar or wind, I mean, those are great sources of environmental power, but they need a solid baseline power. And they want to know that it's always going to be there for them. And so they need that reliability on a go-forward basis. And so we're going to see this increase over time more and more. And they also want to be able to tell their users, we're using green power. We're an environmentally friendly company. So this is not going to die down. We're going to see increasing demand where companies are actually saying it has to be nuclear. Because yes, we like to do solar as well, but we need that solid baseline power for what we're doing.
We're looking a lot in general about, again, I'll bring up the idea of energy independence, and this really started with the Russian incursion into Ukraine. A lot of countries, specifically in Europe, rely on Russia for some of their source of energy and are obviously now looking at ways to build that supply internally. Germany is a great example of that, bringing that nuclear back on. Is this going to drive other countries as well that maybe once have turned off the taps, so to speak, on those nuclear reactors to fire those back up? And if so, how do we look at that? Because again, nuclear was thought to be going away. We thought there was going to be an energy transition to solar, wind, and other sources. It's now looking like those are just going to be additive to what we're already producing from an broad energy perspective, and that there's this, again, huge element of demand that we haven't accounted for. That's potentially going to double energy demand by 2050, for example. Nuclear and uranium obviously can play a big role in that, but is there something holding it back? Is there something that's not quite green still about nuclear? And politically, can that be a headwind to that use expanding going forward?
Yeah, it's interesting because we've seen nuclear power be the, well, we don't want to be there. We're concerned about the storage, and we don't see this as an environmental solution. In the last few years, that's totally flipped. The countries have gotten together at their meetings and basically said, no, this is green power. We now acknowledge this is a green solution. And so that's totally changed. And we're seeing, for instance, the banks, the major banks around the world saying, hey, we'll step up to the plate and help finance this as well. So it's all on board. Governments are around the world saying we want to go forward. We're seeing this even in Canada, expansions of nuclear power plants in Ontario as well. So there is no bad news for the nuclear industry right now and the demand for uranium. That's just it. And that's why it's been frustrating, because prices been not behaving as well as it should. So investors are getting frustrated because they know there's a deficit on a go-forward basis. And they're saying, well, uranium should be responding to all this good news. But there's other factors going on in the short term that change the way we see things.
So this certainly sounds like a great long-term trend for investors to get in on and allocate into their portfolio, again, with an eye to the future, the long term. What's the best way to do that? Do we invest directly in the uranium price itself? Do we invest in uranium stocks? How do you look at that part of it?
Well, people can't buy uranium per se and keep it at home. It just doesn't work that way. You can buy uranium stocks. There are a few. It's not like there's a huge number of those, but you can buy a few of those. You can also buy an ETF representing uranium stocks, and there's also a uranium ETF that actually stores uranium as well. So it really comes down to those three, where you're either buying uranium through an ETF, uranium stocks themselves, or an ETF representing the stocks.
And I think probably a holistic approach to that makes a lot of sense, both the price that, as you say, hasn't really responded to all these new sources of demand, but then also the companies that are going to benefit from that down the road.
I think that we could see what's the catalyst that's going to take place coming up? What's going to move the price of uranium? And that's what everybody's waiting for. You know, the way I see it right now is we know there's a deficit. We know there's a deficit in copper. We know there's a deficit in a lot of the commodities. But what we've seen so far is we've seen technology stocks, the Mag 7 stocks, really attract a lot of international capital. They've really sucked up the money into that area. And people aren't looking in the commodity area, generally speaking. If we go back, the parallel to this would be back in the late 1990s, going to 2000, we saw the internet stocks do extremely well. Now, obviously, there are some differences as well. But what we saw was the commodity stocks in that time did not do well at all. And oil didn't do well, uranium. But when the tech bubble broke, and I'm not saying we're in a bubble, but when the tech bubble broke and the internet did change things, and everybody's counting on the internet to change the way we did business, and it did, but nevertheless, they got too highly priced. And we saw the technology stocks pull back in the early 2000s. That's when we saw the commodities really go through what's called a super cycle. And uranium did extremely well in that time period. So if you go back to that time period, because all of a sudden everybody goes, hey, did you guys just realize that we're short uranium? We're short agriculture, we're short all this stuff. And so we saw the price of uranium from 2001 into 2007, it went up over 1,800%. That's a huge move. So if you take a look at where the low is right now with uranium, that's back in 2016 to where we are approximately now late in 2024, we've gone up just over 250%. So relatively speaking to that trend that's taken place back in 2001 to 2007, we really haven't gone up very much at all. So I think the big uptake potentially for uranium could be down the road. And it can still do well in the meantime, but when we go into another commodity type super cycle, because there is some relationship between, correlation between the commodities in general and uranium, because it is a commodity as well. So generally when commodities are doing well, it also helps pick up the price of uranium.
It's an interesting parallel you made back to the 90s as well. Of course, a lot of investor interest in those internet names at the time, and now in technology names in general. We've talked about AI and how that's creating demand for energy, but also investor dollars going towards that sort of AI trend and technology in general. So perhaps as we move beyond that, and who knows again what that catalyst might be, investor interest and focus goes back to that commodity landscape and perhaps uranium as well.
Absolutely, and in the short term, there could be other catalysts. Uranium can still do well. If we take a look at commodities since 2022, we've seen commodities, if you're using the CRB, Reuters Jeffrey Index, has actually come down since 2022. Uranium has actually pulled back down, but from there we did see a pullback with commodities. But recently we've seen uranium actually start to move higher on a relative basis compared to commodities. So it's actually holding its own. So there is some interest. We are seeing some strength relative to commodities. It's just we're not seeing a huge amount of strength. And I do think that we could see other catalysts come up. And I think at some point we could see uranium doing well. I think another driver that I want to mention as well is that utility companies have really been buying uranium on the spot market a lot. They haven't been committing to long-term contracts over the years. Now that's actually been changing in the last couple of years because they know there's a deficit. So what they're doing is we're starting to see more term contracts come on stream. But they've been playing this game of chicken, knowing there's a deficit on a go-forward basis and saying, well, we're still going to hang out at the spot price versus buying out into the future. And then when you start to see more and more term contracts, I think that's also going to help support a higher price as well. So there is nothing negative to say about uranium from the demand perspective, from the catalysts as well. And there could be other catalysts, and with hyperscalers, maybe they really start to grow and drive that even higher as well. More countries come on board. We really haven't seen any bad news for uranium. It's just a matter of what moves it and how investors see the potential at the time according to what's happening with the narrative of whether it's commodities as well.
Well, thanks to Brooke, and thanks to all of you for watching today as well. Let us know what you think about uranium and nuclear energy in general.